Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, September 1945. 32 female Japanese prisoners arrived expecting brutality. Their military had told them Americans were savages who would humiliate captured women. When Sergeant Helen Morrison ordered medical processing, the women locked arms, ready to die rather than face what they believed was coming. What happened next would shatter everything they'd been taught about their enemy, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war isn't violence, but unwavering human decency. The transport truck rolled through Fort McCoy's gates at 14:37 hours on September 18, 1945, carrying 32 Japanese women who had served in various capacities: nurses, translators, communication officers, captured during the final Pacific campaigns. The Wisconsin autumn air was crisp, smelling of pine and distant wood smoke, a stark contrast to the tropical heat they'd left behind. Through the canvas flaps, they could see rows of barracks, American flags snapping in the wind, and armed guards in olive-drab uniforms watching their arrival with expressionless faces. Inside the truck, the women sat rigid, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. The youngest, Corporal Akiko Tanaka, was 19 years old, from a fishing village outside Nagasaki. The oldest, Lieutenant Haruko Yamamoto, was 42, a career military nurse who had served in Manchuria, China, and finally Okinawa. What united them wasn't just their service or their capture, it was their absolute certainty that they were about to face systematic degradation that their training had promised awaited all female prisoners. Japanese military doctrine had been explicit and unrelenting in its messaging. American soldiers were barbarians who would humiliate captured women through forced public disrobing, invasive examinations performed by male officers, and systematic abuse designed to break their spirit. Death, they had been taught repeatedly, was preferable to the shame that capture would bring. Many carried cyanide capsules hidden in uniform seams. Some had already attempted suicide during transport, only to be stopped by exhausted American medics who treated their wounds with a gentleness that confused them. Sergeant Helen Morrison, United States Army Nurse Corps, stood waiting as the truck's tailgate dropped. She was 34 years old, from Des Moines, Iowa, where her father ran a hardware store and her mother taught third grade. She had enlisted in 1942 after Pearl Harbor, trained at Camp McCoy itself, and spent 3 years treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals from North Africa to France. She had seen the worst of humanity: young men torn apart by artillery, burned victims from tank battles, the psychological devastation of combat. She had also seen the best: medics running into fire to save wounded enemies, soldiers sharing their rations with starving civilians, commanders who wept for every casualty. Morrison had been briefed about the prisoners 3 days earlier. Intelligence reports indicated these women expected abuse. Japanese propaganda had convinced them that capture meant systematic violation. Morrison's commanding officer, Major Robert Chen, himself a Chinese American who had faced discrimination despite his uniform, had been clear: these women have been lied to about who we are. We're going to show them the truth, by the book, by regulations, but most importantly, with the basic human respect that defines what we're fighting for. The women descended from the truck in silence, forming a tight cluster in the compound's center. Guards maintained respectful distance, 15 feet per protocol, weapons shouldered, not aimed. Morrison stepped forward, accompanied by 2 female translators, Corporal Jane Nakamura and Private Sarah Kobayashi, both Japanese Americans from California's 422nd Regimental Combat Team Support Units. Both had family who'd been interned at Manzanar. Both understood exactly what they were fighting to prove about American values. "My name is Sergeant Helen Morrison," she began, waiting for translation. "You will be processed according to Geneva Convention protocols. You will be examined by female medical personnel only. You will be provided clean uniforms and adequate facilities. You will be treated with the respect owed to prisoners of war. Do you understand?" The women didn't respond. Lieutenant Yamamoto, standing at the front, had her jaw set so tight Morrison could see the muscle jumping. The prisoners had been trained for this. The initial lies meant to create false security before the real abuse began. "I need you to proceed to the medical facility for health screening," Morrison continued. "This is standard procedure for all prisoners, male or female. You will not be—" "No." Yamamoto's voice was harsh, loud enough that nearby guards tensed. Through the translator, her words came clear. "We know what you intend. We will not submit to humiliation. You will have to kill us first." Morrison had expected resistance, but the totality of their certainty was sobering. These weren't women being difficult. They were women preparing to die rather than face what they genuinely believed was inevitable degradation. Around the compound, American personnel who had gathered to observe the arrival shifted uncomfortably. Many were veterans of Pacific campaigns. They had seen Japanese soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender, had seen civilians jump from cliffs in Saipan, choosing death over American captivity. Understanding the depth of enemy propaganda was one thing. Confronting women who believed they were about to be systematically abused was another. "No one will humiliate you," Morrison said quietly. "No one will harm you. I give you my word as a sergeant in the United States Army, as a nurse who has sworn an oath to do no harm, and as a woman who understands exactly what you're afraid of." Yamamoto's laugh was bitter. "Your word means nothing. We have been told what Americans do to captured women. We will not cooperate." The standoff had begun. 32 women prepared to fight to the death. 100 American personnel wondering how to prove they meant no harm to people who had been systematically taught that harm was inevitable. And Morrison, standing in the September sunlight, realized that this moment, this quiet confrontation in a Wisconsin POW camp, was going to require something that couldn't be found in any regulation manual. It was going to require trust. And trust, she knew, couldn't be ordered. It had to be earned. The standoff continued for 6 hours. The September sun tracked across the sky, shadows lengthening across Fort McCoy's compounds. The women remained clustered in the center of the processing area, refusing to move toward the medical facility. They had locked arms, forming a tight circle with the younger prisoners in the center, the older ones facing outward. Several were crying silently. Others maintained expressions of rigid determination. 2 had begun praying, quiet Buddhist chants that carried across the space. Morrison had ordered all male personnel back to distant positions. The only Americans in immediate vicinity were herself, the 2 translators, and 4 female military police officers, who maintained careful, non-threatening postures at the compound's perimeter. Major Chen had authorized her to handle the situation however she deemed necessary, with one absolute requirement: no force unless lives were in immediate danger. "We're at an impasse," Morrison told Nakamura quietly, at the 3-hour mark. "They genuinely believe we're lying. How do we prove intent when they've been trained to see any promise as deception?" Nakamura, whose own parents were still in Manzanar despite her brother having died fighting for the 442nd in Italy, considered carefully. In Japanese culture, actions speak louder than words. They need to see proof, not hear promises, but they won't move toward the medical facility to see that proof, because they believe that's where the abuse will happen. "Catch-22, Morrison muttered. "We can't prove we mean no harm without them experiencing the process, but they won't experience the process because they're certain it will harm them." Private Kobayashi had been watching the prisoners carefully. "Sergeant, look at Lieutenant Yamamoto. She's the leader, the oldest, probably the most experienced. She's protecting the younger ones. If we could get her to trust us, just her, the others might follow." Morrison studied Yamamoto. The woman stood rigid, sweating despite the cooling temperature, clearly exhausted, but refusing to show weakness. She had positioned herself directly between the younger prisoners and the Americans, a human shield. Everything about her posture screamed military discipline and absolute conviction. Corporal Nakamura, Morrison said slowly, an idea forming. Ask Lieutenant Yamamoto if she'll agree to go through the medical processing herself, alone, as proof for the others. Tell her if we do anything she considers disrespectful, she can report it to her fellow prisoners and they can take whatever action they deem appropriate. We're offering her the chance to verify our intentions before asking anyone else to trust us. The translation took several minutes, back and forth, clarifications and questions. Yamamoto's response was sharp. Why should I believe you'll let me report anything? You could simply detain me and then tell the others whatever lies you want. Morrison thought hard. Then, against all protocol, she made a decision. Tell her this, she'll go through processing with one of her own people accompanying her as witness. Not as a prisoner being processed, but as an observer. Pick whoever she trusts most. That person will watch everything we do and report back to the group. If the witness says we behaved dishonorably, we'll figure out another solution. Major Chen, monitoring from a distance via radio, immediately protested in Morrison's earpiece. Sergeant, that's not in the protocols. You can't give prisoners that kind of control. Sir, with respect, the protocols didn't anticipate women who'd rather die than be processed because enemy propaganda convinced them we're monsters. We need to improvise. After a long pause, you have 1 hour, Sergeant. Make it work. Yamamoto conferred with her group for 20 minutes, intense whispered discussion in Japanese. Finally, she pointed to Corporal Tanaka, the youngest prisoner, and spoke rapidly. Nakamura translated, "She says Corporal Tanaka will observe. If anything inappropriate happens, any male personnel present, any unnecessary undressing, any invasion of privacy, Tanaka will report it, and they will resist to the death. She wants our agreement that no punishment will come to Tanaka for observing." Agreed, Morrison said immediately. Corporal Tanaka will be treated as a witness, not a prisoner, for the duration of the processing. She can report whatever she sees without fear of punishment. The walk to the medical facility was surreal. Yamamoto walked stiffly, like someone approaching an execution. Tanaka followed 3 steps behind, eyes darting to every corner, every shadow, clearly expecting ambush. Morrison led them into a building that had been a standard Army field hospital before Fort McCoy's conversion to a POW facility. Inside, it was clean, well-lit, and staffed entirely by female nurses and doctors. Morrison had made sure of that. Lieutenant Yamamoto, this is Captain Sarah Thompson, United States Army Medical Corps, Morrison said through the translator. Thompson, a 40-year-old physician from Boston, nodded respectfully. Captain Thompson will conduct your medical examination. Corporal Tanaka may observe from any position she chooses. No one else will be present. Yamamoto's hands were shaking. She clearly expected this to be the moment when the lies would drop and the abuse would begin. Tanaka positioned herself by the door, eyes wide, ready to run if necessary. Thompson moved slowly, explaining each step before executing it. I need to check your vital signs, temperature, blood pressure, heart rate. I'll need to look at your throat and ears for infections. I'll need to listen to your lungs. If you have any injuries or medical concerns, please tell me, and I'll address them. Through the translator, Yamamoto responded with wooden formality. I understand. What followed was 45 minutes of standard medical processing that, to Morrison watching, seemed agonizingly slow, but absolutely necessary. Thompson never asked Yamamoto to remove more than 1 article of clothing at a time. A screen was provided when examination of torso or back was needed. No one except Thompson touched Yamamoto. Every instrument was explained before use. Every procedure was described in detail through the translator. And gradually, impossibly, Yamamoto's rigid terror began to crack, not into trust, not yet, but into confusion. This wasn't what she had been promised. There were no male guards laughing at her vulnerability, no forced nudity in front of crowds, no invasive procedures designed for humiliation. just a middle-aged female doctor performing a competent, respectful medical examination while explaining each step. When it was over, Thompson provided clean undergarments, a POW uniform that actually fit, and basic hygiene supplies. You have a partially healed burn on your left arm that needs continued treatment. I'll provide ointment and clean bandages. You also show signs of malnutrition and dehydration, common in recent prisoners. You'll be provided adequate meals and water. Do you have any questions about your medical condition? Yamamoto stared at the doctor for a long moment. Then, through the translator, quietly, "Why are you doing this?" Thompson looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Because you're a prisoner of war, entitled to humane treatment under international law. And because regardless of what uniform you wear, you're a human being who deserves basic medical care and dignity." "That's not a complicated concept, Lieutenant." When Yamamoto and Tanaka returned to the waiting group, the other women crowded around them immediately, rapid-fire questions in Japanese. Morrison watched from a distance, not approaching, giving them space to process whatever Tanaka was reporting. She could see the disbelief on faces, the arguments, the skepticism. Several women were clearly convinced this was an elaborate deception. But then Yamamoto spoke, her voice carrying across the compound. Through the translator, Morrison heard, "They kept their word, everything they promised. It was not what we were told to expect. Not trust, not yet, but the first crack in the certainty of propaganda." And sometimes, Morrison thought, that's where transformation begins. Fort McCoy's intelligence officers watched with fascination as news of the American POW treatment began to spread through captured Japanese populations across the Pacific. The ripple effect wasn't immediate. Propaganda believed for years doesn't crumble in a day, but it was measurable. Prisoners who had attempted suicide in transport began accepting medical treatment. Women captured in subsequent operations resisted less violently, though still with intense suspicion. Interrogators reported that female prisoners, once processed, became more willing to provide basic information, not from coercion, but from sheer confusion about their treatment. The Japanese military command, receiving reports through intelligence channels and returned prisoner exchanges, struggled to comprehend what was happening. Their entire doctrine regarding enemy treatment of captured women was being contradicted by systematic evidence. Radio intercepts of Japanese communications showed rising frustration as commanders demanded to know why propaganda wasn't matching prisoner reports. One intercepted message, decoded by cryptographers at Fort Meade and shared with Fort McCoy's command staff, was particularly revealing. A Japanese colonel receiving reports from repatriated prisoners about conditions in American camps wrote, "Either our intelligence regarding American treatment of female prisoners was fundamentally incorrect, or the Americans are conducting an elaborate psychological operation designed to make our personnel more willing to surrender. We must determine which, but either conclusion is devastating to morale." At Fort McCoy, the 32 women who had arrived in September were now 3 months into their internment. The camp had been designed to house them separately from male prisoners, in barracks that had been modified to provide privacy, adequate sanitation, and reasonable comfort. Not luxury, but conditions that met Geneva Convention standards. They worked in the camp gardens, received mail from International Red Cross, and attended educational classes in English, taught by volunteer instructors. Lieutenant Yamamoto had become an unofficial liaison between the prisoners and American staff. It wasn't an official role. She held no authority over her fellow prisoners as the war was over. But her willingness to communicate had become crucial to the camp's functioning. In December, she requested a meeting with Sergeant Morrison. They met in Morrison's office, a converted storage room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a small heating stove that fought against Wisconsin's brutal winter. Snow was falling outside, the kind of heavy, silent snowfall that Yamamoto, from southern Japan, had never experienced before internment. "Sergeant Morrison," Yamamoto began through Nakamura's translation, "I need to understand something. We were told Americans were barbarians, that captured women would face systematic abuse, that death was preferable to capture. We believed this completely. Why were we lied to so thoroughly?" Morrison considered her response carefully. "Your military needed you to fight to the death rather than surrender. If you believed capture meant torture and humiliation, you'd fight harder, resist longer, maybe kill yourselves rather than be taken prisoner. Fear is a powerful weapon. Your command used it against you." "But why?" Yamamoto pressed. "Why would they lie about something so fundamental?" "Because," Morrison said quietly, "if you knew that American forces would treat you according to international law, would feed you, provide medical care, and respect your basic dignity, would you have fought as hard? Would young soldiers have chosen death over capture if they knew capture might mean survival?" The silence stretched. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Finally, Yamamoto spoke again. "We were told Americans had no honor, that you were motivated only by material greed, an individual weakness, that your nation was too soft, too diverse, too undisciplined to fight effectively. We believed our spiritual strength and unity would overcome your technological advantages." "How's that working out?" Morrison asked, not unkindly. "We lost," Yamamoto said simply. "Completely. The war is over. And I am sitting in a heated office, drinking coffee, having a voluntary conversation with a sergeant who has never once treated me with disrespect. Everything I was taught about Americans was wrong. Everything. Do you understand how devastating that realization is?" Morrison did understand. She had seen it in German POWs who arrived expecting brutal treatment and instead found themselves working on American farms, paid wages, and eating meals with families who had sons fighting against Germany. She had seen the cognitive dissonance in Italian prisoners who couldn't reconcile Nazi propaganda about American degeneracy with the reality of American soldiers sharing candy with Italian children. "Lieutenant," Morrison said carefully, "what happens after this, when you're repatriated to Japan?" "I don't know," Yamamoto admitted. "Japan is occupied now. Everything we knew is destroyed. Emperor Hirohito has renounced divinity. Our military is disbanded. The world we fought for no longer exists, and we must return to it knowing that we sacrificed everything for leaders who lied to us about something as fundamental as the enemy's basic humanity." "That's a heavy burden," Morrison acknowledged. "Yes," Yamamoto agreed, "but perhaps necessary. We were part of a military machine that committed terrible atrocities across Asia. We believed propaganda about racial superiority, about divine destiny, about the necessity of conquest, maybe experiencing the collapse of those beliefs, seeing that the enemy we were taught to hate treated us with more decency than our own command did. Maybe that's the foundation for rebuilding something better." The conversation haunted Morrison for days afterward. She thought about it when processing new prisoners, when training new staff, when writing reports for command. The psychological victory of humane treatment was something the Pentagon had never quite figured into their strategic calculations. You could measure tank production, aircraft carriers, industrial capacity. But how did you measure the weapon of proving that you weren't the monster enemy propaganda had painted? In February 1946, as repatriation operations accelerated, Yamamoto and her group prepared to return to Japan. Morrison was present for their departure, a cold morning with snow still on the ground and a bus waiting to take them to the railway station for the first leg of their journey to San Francisco and ships bound for Yokohama. Yamamoto approached Morrison one final time. Through Nakamura, who would also be leaving Fort McCoy, transferred back to California and civilian life, she said, "Sergeant Morrison, I want you to know something. When I return to Japan, I will tell people what I experienced here. I will tell them that American forces treated me and my companions with dignity when we expected degradation. I will tell them that sometimes the most powerful thing an enemy can do is show you that they're not actually your enemy, just another human being following different orders. What you do with that information is your choice, Lieutenant, Morrison replied. But I'm glad you're taking it with you. As the bus pulled away, Morrison watched it until it disappeared around the camp's perimeter. She thought about cycles of violence and how they broke, about propaganda and truth, about the sometimes impossible task of proving humanity to people who had been taught you had none. And she thought that sometimes the most important victories in war weren't won with weapons. They were won with basic decency in moments when indecency was expected. The ripples of Fort McCoy's approach to female POWs extended far beyond that one camp in Wisconsin. As military historians began examining the Pacific War in the decades following, they increasingly recognized that American adherence to Geneva Convention standards, even when dealing with enemies who had not shown reciprocal treatment, had represented a strategic victory that wasn't quantifiable in traditional military terms. Dr. Michael Takahashi, a historian at Stanford University, whose mother had been among the Fort McCoy prisoners, published research in 1978 examining the long-term impact of POW treatment on post-war Japanese society. His findings were remarkable. Prisoners who had experienced American detention facilities became disproportionately active in Japan's post-war reconstruction, often advocating for democratic reforms and international cooperation. The psychological impact of having their propaganda-fed expectations completely contradicted by reality had created a generation of Japanese women willing to question authority and demand accountability. The expected treatment, Takahashi wrote, would have confirmed every stereotype Japanese military propaganda had established. These women would have returned to Japan with their trauma as evidence that the enemy was indeed inhuman. Instead, they returned with a deeply destabilizing message, that the enemy had treated them with more dignity than their own command had shown. This cognitive dissonance became a foundation for questioning the authoritarian structures that had led Japan into disastrous war. Lieutenant Yamamoto, who lived until 2001, became a nurse educator in post-war Japan, training a generation of medical professionals with emphasis on patient dignity and ethical treatment, regardless of patient background. In interviews late in life, she repeatedly returned to her experiences at Fort McCoy as formative. "I expected monsters," she said in a 1995 documentary. "I encountered human beings who followed rules I had been taught didn't exist. It completely rewrote my understanding of what warfare could be, what enemies could be, what humanity meant in impossible circumstances." The operational impact was equally significant. By 1946, American military doctrine formally incorporated the strategic value of humane POW treatment into training materials. The assumption had always been that following Geneva Convention standards was a legal and moral obligation. What Fort McCoy and similar facilities demonstrated was that it was also tactically advantageous. Prisoners who expected abuse and received dignity became more willing to provide intelligence, less likely to attempt escape or violence, and upon repatriation, less likely to view America as an enemy requiring eternal opposition. The ripples extended into subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, American forces dealing with female prisoners from North Korean and Chinese forces applied lessons learned from World War II. The protocol developed at Fort McCoy, female staff conducting all medical processing, strict privacy standards, transparent procedures explained through translators, became standard practice. Not because it was required by law, which it was, but because it had proven operationally effective. The contrast with other approaches was stark. Soviet treatment of German female prisoners, Japanese treatment of Allied women throughout Asia, and subsequent examples of POW abuse by various forces through the 20th century all demonstrated predictable outcomes. Brutalized prisoners either died, became completely traumatized, or returned home as evidence of enemy savagery, thereby hardening resistance. The American approach produced the opposite: prisoners who returned home with the unsettling message that the enemy had been more honorable than their own command. Sergeant Helen Morrison, who stayed in military nursing through the Korean War before retiring to Iowa in 1953, never considered her actions at Fort McCoy particularly remarkable. In a 1987 interview for an oral history project, she said, "We just followed the rules. The Geneva Convention was clear. Women had to be processed by female staff, prisoners were entitled to dignity and basic human rights, and humane treatment wasn't optional based on reciprocity. I don't understand why that's considered special. It was literally just doing our jobs according to regulations." But that simplicity was precisely the point. In a war that had seen systematic atrocities on multiple continents, where dehumanization of enemies was standard propaganda practice, where brutality was often considered tactically justified, maintaining basic human decency required conscious choice. Every guard who maintained respectful distance, every translator who explained procedures patiently, every doctor who provided the same standard of care to prisoners as to American soldiers, every commander who insisted on protocol, even when dealing with enemies whose forces had committed atrocities against Allied prisoners. These weren't dramatic battlefield heroics. They were quiet, daily choices to treat human beings as human beings, regardless of uniform. And cumulatively, they represented a strategic victory that reverberated for decades. The final validation came in 1999, when the International Committee of the Red Cross published comprehensive analysis of POW treatment throughout the 20th century. American facilities like Fort McCoy were held up as examples of how adherence to international humanitarian law produced not only moral legitimacy, but tangible strategic advantages. Nations that treated prisoners humanely faced less resistance from future prisoners, generated more useful intelligence, and produced post-war populations less committed to eternal hostility. The lesson was elegant in its simplicity. In the long term, decency is more powerful than cruelty. The women who arrived at Fort McCoy in September 1945 expecting systematic abuse and instead encountered systematic respect became living evidence that propaganda collapses when confronted with contrary reality. They returned to Japan carrying a message that undermined decades of militarist indoctrination, that the enemy they had been taught to see as subhuman barbarians had in fact treated them with more honor than their own command ever had. That message, multiplied across thousands of prisoners in dozens of facilities throughout the Pacific, became part of Japan's post-war transformation from militarist empire to democratic ally. Not the only factor. American occupation policies, economic reconstruction, and internal Japanese reform movements all played crucial roles, but a significant element nonetheless. The doctrine that emerged from Fort McCoy and similar facilities was simple. In warfare, as in all human interaction, the choice to maintain dignity, even when dealing with enemies, is never weakness. It's the foundation of a peace that can actually last. And sometimes the most devastating weapon in war is simply refusing to become the monster your enemy's propaganda claims you are. This story of courage, dignity, and the collapse of hatred's foundation is just one chapter in the untold history of World War II. If you want to learn more about the moments when humanity prevailed even in war's darkest hours, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most about this story? And check out our other videos exploring the hidden heroes and forgotten truths of the Second World War. Remember, understanding history isn't just about knowing what happened. It's about learning why decency matters, even when facing the darkest challenges. See you in the next story.